Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to the Corbett Report. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com in May of 2024 with another edition of Questions for Corbett. And this week we're going to take our prompt from a user who left a particular question on the May Open thread. In this case, pkadams, Corbett Report member pkadams, left this particular question. Dear James, I've been thinking about Larry Fink's involvement with the Fed. Seeing how the economy has not collapsed yet, despite many warnings by various economists and YouTubers, I was wondering if Fink actually saved the dollar or delayed the collapse by going direct. It seems to me that we have a new baseline for prices. I predict that wages will gradually catch up. I was also thinking that although it did cause inflation, maybe flooding the economy with new money was the only solution to the economic crisis caused by the COVID lockdowns. Did the US manage to hang on to global dominance by these measures? What say you? I'd love a video or podcast on the current economic situation, high inflation, and strong economy. Well, pkadams, you ask, I'll answer. In fact, I'll go above and beyond. I'm not going to give you my insane ramblings. I'm going to bring on someone who really, truly knows what they are talking about with regards to this issue. Now, if people are totally lost, have no idea who Larry Fink is or what going direct refers to, I suggest you do some catching up. I will humbly suggest, and it's easy to link to, so I will link to CorbettReport.com/BlackRock, my podcast episode on how BlackRock conquered the world. But within that particular episode of the podcast, you will of course find links and references to the work of John Titus, aka Best Evidence, on BitChute and Odyssey and I guess ThemTube and Substack and other places besides. And I hope you have followed the cookie crumb trail back to the work of John Titus, who was the one who was really in the early dark days of the scamdemic digging up this information about this whole scandal, shenanigans, going direct. What even is this? So I will put those links, all of them will be in the show notes for this edition of Questions for Corbett, but let's bring him on to this conversation so we can start drilling down into the depths of this question. John Titus, thank you very much for coming back on the Corbett Report.
James Corbett, good to see you again, and thanks for having me again.
Excellent. Well, okay, we're here. We're back together. And so, as I say, I would like people to follow my work on BlackRock back to your work, really spearheading this. For example, Larry and Karsten's Excellent Pandemic is a video I've cited a number of times because you lay in a 1-hour presentation, you lay it all out exactly what happened with regards to the going direct shenanigans and how that played into what was then passed off as the scamdemic. And all of that. In fact, in that video, you demonstrate, which was very useful, and I'm glad that you did this. You showed how to use Fred, the St. Louis Fed's economic data website, and how to construct the graph of liabilities and capital, total liabilities, less eliminations versus all commercial bank deposits, and how to show on the graph, you can see the exact moment at which the going direct started going direct, and they started literally pumping the money directly, crossing those streams of the split monetary circuit. All of this information, as I say, is in your in-depth presentation there. I will also direct people to a summary going direct reset that was written by yourself, published by Solari.com, and that has, in addition to that graph that we just talked about, also has a graph of Fed digital liabilities versus M2 money supply, and shows, again, you can see when going direct started to happen, and suddenly they're crossing the monetary streams. As I say, there's a lot of catching up for people who are just new to all of this information, so there's lots of background to this, but let's get into it, because I think the heart of the question is, okay, we heard about all the going direct shenanigans, we saw it, we demonstrated how it took place, and the fact that BlackRock was essentially dictating policy to the Fed. Wow, that was crazy. But now here we are in 2024, and, well, everything seems to be functioning. I'm still getting money and paying for things and eating and surviving, so it must have all worked out, right? So I guess the heart of the question, John Titus, did Larry Fink save the dollar?
No. He did, however, to use the parlance of that question, there is a new price level. For example, onions in my grocery store are $1.69 a pound, and before the pandemic, they were 59 cents a pound. That's a new price level, and that's a direct result of the going direct reset implemented by the Fed starting in March of 2020. When we went into that period, And when the Fed began to putatively respond to the pandemic, we have to do all this stuff to the pandemic, you understand, even though there's not even 1 million people infected yet. They began pumping in $5 trillion. But unlike the quantitative easing that they did in 2008 and the global financial crisis, when the Fed ginned up new money, and this time it was $5 trillion. The first go around in 2008, it was about 1.5 or 2 trillion. So it was over 2 times as much. But that's not the real difference between pandemic QE and global financial crisis QE. The real difference is what the Fed did with that money. The 2008 quantitative easing, that was a bailout of the banks. So what the Fed did is it ginned up money out of thin air, and it always does that. It's a bank of issue. That's what banks of issue do. They create money out of thin air and they buy stuff. Most of the time they're buying loans, IOUs from customers. In 2008, what the Fed did is it bought assets from banks, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and the gang. Not what happened in 2020. What they did in 2020 is they bought assets from non-banks. Hence, Larry Fink, head of BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, $10 trillion under management. If you rank it in terms of countries by GDP, it would be number 2 or 3. It is absolutely massive. It's a planetary-sized organization. Larry Fink was brought in, and the Fed signed a waiver that allowed Larry and BlackRock to buy assets that Larry and BlackRock owned themselves. And by buying from non-banks, you say, well, what's the difference? They buy from banks and now buying from non-banks. Why do I care about that? The reason you care about that is that when the Fed takes $1 and it buys an asset from a bank, it's just reserves. It's in a private circuit, only where the Fed is the bank, and the commercial banks are the bank customers. It's a very kind of a small club. When, on the other hand, and by contrast, the Fed spends $1 and buys an asset from a non-bank, it creates $1 of new reserves, but guess what else it creates? $1 of bank deposits. When we went into the pandemic QE of March of 2020, the commercial deposit base in the United States, if you add up all the money in the bank accounts in the U.S., $13.5 trillion. When it was all said and done, about $18.5 trillion. There was $5 trillion more of bank money in the system. You add $5 trillion on top of $13.5 trillion, what do you get? You get inflation. Mervyn King, the former head of the Bank of England, threw the Fed under the bus in an interview. He says that's why by buying from businesses and not from non-banks, you have inflation in the U.S. That's where it came from. I'm not the only one saying this. Mervyn King said it too. So a new price level was established, and that's a direct result of pandemic QE, of having Larry Fink in there buying assets from non-banks, as specified in a plan authored by BlackRock in July of 2019 and presented to the Fed at the Jackson Hole conference held annually every year. It's hosted by the Kansas City Fed. It takes place in Wyoming. It's the I just said the name of it. The conference, the Jackson Hole.
Yeah.
Jackson Hole, and that plan was hatched before anybody really heard of COVID or coronavirus. That plan was put into place and was discussed in July of 2019. And the plan said, look, you're going to have a big crisis. And when you do, here's what to do. And lo and behold, the crisis starts 2 months later in September and rolls into January and February of 2020. And that's all she wrote. Now, was it the end of the world? Did it cause a collapse? No, it didn't. It inflated a lot of people's bank accounts. Most important, the biggest of which inflation occurred in the top 0.1% of asset holders in the U.S. So the wealthiest 0.1% in the U.S. saw their bank accounts their checking accounts go from an average of $565,000 to $5 million. That is pandemic QE right there. So it didn't really cause a collapse. It did cause inflation. It also massively reshuffled wealth. It was basically extracted money from the poor and from the middle class and really from the upper middle class to the ultra wealthy. And that is why you saw billionaires be minted like there was no tomorrow. And you also saw existing billionaires double, triple, quadruple, multiply their money by 10 times during the pandemic. That was all a feeding frenzy caused by the Fed's $5 trillion asset purchase program during the pandemic. That's what that did. Didn't kill the dollar. It weakened it against commodities and weakened it against real goods. But across the world, if you actually look, the dollar's done pretty well against other currencies.
Yes. In fact, I wanted to speak to that specifically because from my perch here in Japan, you mentioned the new price level, for example, for the onions going from whatever, 69 cents to $1.69. Well, in Japanese yen, back in the beginning of the scamdemic, that would have been 75, 80 yen, something like that. But now the new $1.69 level is, I don't know, 250, 275 yen, whatever it is, because the yen has been crashing against the dollar, the US dollar, that is. Not so much against the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, which is my way of understanding this. Yeah, definitely the dollar seems to be, relatively speaking, the best house in a bad neighborhood, something like that. Why is the dollar so strong, relatively speaking?
It's the whale at the poker table. I mean, when the whale acts, you better follow the whale or get off the table. I mean, right now, I think something like between 55 and 60% of assets worldwide are denominated in U.S. dollars. Okay, the dollar is not going to. So these fantasies and these scenarios of the dollar plunging and going off the cliff, never going to happen. And the reason it's never going to happen is the oligarchs throughout the world own dollar-denominated assets. It's in no one's interest who has real power in the world to see the dollar plunge in these, zero hedge like fantasies where the dollar just vanishes into nothing. That's ludicrous. It's not going to happen. The debt-based monetary system, it's every which is worldwide. We're one of a lot of countries. There are precious few countries that do not issue money in the form of debt. We're the leader of the pack, though, and we have been for a long time. And that the fact that we're the leader, we're a producer of size, or at least a bank of size, and we have been for a long time. We have a long track record of doing this. 60% of assets denominated in dollars, that's a big number. And so when the Fed does something radical like this, it's got an inherent advantage over the other players at the table because it knows what it's going to do, and Larry Fink knows what it's going to do because he's the one doing it, right? And so everybody else is following along. I think that goes a long way in explaining why the U.S. is ahead of all these other currencies. They just have inherently weaker currencies, and they're following this monstrosity of a dollar. They're making moves to get away from it, to be sure, but it's going to take a long time to dethrone the king dollar because of its this size. I mean, you can't chip away at that thing. You can only chip away at it. You can't take it down overnight. It's never going to happen.
Well, I would only quibble to say that I think, barring war, because war tends to be the thing that always goes along with the great monetary paradigm shifts. As World War I saw the eclipsing of the pound as the central world reserve currency into the U.S. dollar system post World War II, it was the great shakeup of the world, and at the point at which the U.S. is militarily destroyed. I mean, barring that, I certainly see your point, and it will take, at the very least, decades of this kind of Chinese yuan gradual buildup of something. Will they ever be able to, not conceivably in the paradigm as it exists? So I think that's what we're really facing. Is ultimately
that is a great point about war, because if you want to destroy a currency, historically there are two ways to do it. One is to borrow money in a foreign currency and then watch that currency drift up against yours, and you now owe more money than ever because you got on the wrong side of that bet. The second tried and true way of killing your currency is to lose a world war, to lose a war. That'll do it. And we're kind of, for my money, we're in the early stages of doing that. We've run out of ammo in the Ukraine. We're not a producer nation anymore. Boeing's, is one of the big five military industrial complex companies. Its problems are well known. Less well known are the problems of companies like General Dynamics and Raytheon. Their equipment is being destroyed left, right, and center over in Ukraine. So that's the one to keep your eye on, James Corbett. You're exactly right. Is what's going on with war, and why are we so trigger happy on this war? Because you're sitting on a winning hand. You've got 55, 60%. You're putting that at risk by getting involved in wars where the outcome is not certain.
Agreed. So let's get back to the spirit of PK Adams' question then, because I guess one takeaway from this could be, well, okay, so it slightly impoverished everyone at the table except for the really rich. Okay, usual business as usual, as it were. What's the big deal? It wasn't such a big thing. I guess that could be one takeaway from what's happened over the past few years. Another takeaway would be, okay, so if in 2019 people like yourself were looking at, say, Larry Fink and BlackRock and what they were proposing and seeing what was coming, and then you saw what resulted from that, and that's exactly what's happening right now. It's not a pandemic. It's not even a scamdemic. It's really just a cover for this monetary maneuver that's taking place. Can we scry the tea leaves again? I mean, can we still look at what Larry Fink and BlackRock are proposing in order to understand where things are going next?
I have seen no proposals from BlackRock per se that lead me to believe that they're headed anywhere in particular. But I will say that one of the effects of the pandemic and pandemic QE is it got the Fed much more involved on the fiscal side of things. Typically, even historically, the Fed has stayed away from political decisions. And more it is asserting itself, like, for example, on what kind of assets to buy from non-banks. It's invading a territory where it hasn't been before. And it's going a long way. And that BlackRock paper from 2019 says, the Fed's going to need to get involved more and more on the fiscal side of things. And that's exactly what they've done. And so the camel's nose is now under the tent. And I think what you can expect, and I've gone in the very early stages of kind of dealing with this on my channel and in my videos, is the Fed is going to make moves, legal moves, to strengthen its position, enhance its position. Ultimately, I think I think you'd probably agree with me, it's after a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. That's a longer way off, I think, than some people have warned about. And the Fed needs to make a lot of predicate moves before it can put itself in a position to do that. And those moves are going to be legal in nature, because money it's a legal instrument, and the Fed, because it is a creature of Congress, it's got to be careful with what it does. It's got two big fears. Number one, lawsuits scare the Fed. You might remember back in the global financial crisis, they lost that Pittman and Bloomberg versus the Fed FOIA suit, and so that kind of began the beginning. It was an audit. Ultimately, the results of that. So losing a lawsuit was bad. And the other thing it had coming from the General Accounting Office of the U.S. government was an audit from Congress, because Congress got more and more interested in, like, what are you doing and where's all this money going? So the Fed's got to watch what it does, because the last thing the Fed wants is transparency. The last thing it wants to do is have to open the books to inspection. And that hasn't happened generally, but some inroads were made during that time. So the Fed's got to make a lot of legal moves to get to a position where it gets a CBDC, central bank digital currency. And I think you can expect it to do that. But the precedent has been set as far as kind of buying assets from non-banks and getting involved in fiscal policy and having very deferential Congress members sort of say, well, we're just stupid. For us, we need you experts at the Fed to tell us what to do. The horrible precedent was set during the pandemic in terms of the Fed just being given free rein to do all these things with absolutely no checks and balances. I think you can expect an expansion of that, to be sure.
Well, when you say money is an instrument of law, I start to think, where have I heard that recently? Oh, of course. Please refrain from urinating on the rule of law, Madam Secretary. Your recent video posted up to Best Evidence. After a several-month hiatus, you've got a new video up teasing Season 4 of Mafiocracy, which, as I am given to understand from your little teaser there, is going to be primarily about those rules of law and how they circumscribe what money is in our system as it exists. Can you tell us about Season 4 of Mafiocracy?
Yeah, I'm gonna start for the first time, and I've had this channel. I've been doing videos for 10 years. I'm going to start looking at, well, where, let's just go to the basics. Let's go to the legal basics. Let's start with the U.S. Constitution and talk about what does the Constitution say about money? What does it say about the issuance of money? What does it say about the issuance of credit? Who has that right? And how has the Fed gotten away with what it's gotten away with since 1913, without being thrown out or declared unconstitutional, Federal Reserve Act. How has this gone on? Because once you understand and you see sort of with the meets and bounds of what the Fed has done and sort of where it has slipped in the constitutional cracks, you can kind of see where the Fed is going. And I think ultimately it's important from where I sit not to get too distracted with CBDC and trying to, what's going to go on here, what's going on. It's control. It all comes down to control. And the way they're going to control and the way control is affected in the U.S. is through digital money. That's a long way of saying, keep your eye on the ball. Do not let cash go. The Fed can't control people. If you've got cash, the Fed can't control you because it doesn't know where that cash is. Augustin Carson's of the Bank for International Settlements said as much in October 2020. He says the problem with cash, the problem with a $100 Federal Reserve note or a $1,000 peso note, we don't know who has the damn thing. We don't know what they're spending it on. We don't know where it is. We don't know what's up. That's what they're after with CBDC. It's the elimination of cash. But to get to that, the Fed, they've got to make a lot of moves to get to the elimination of cash. I remember early on in the pandemic, because I absolutely refused to get on airlines and fly around with a diaper on my face. I drove a lot. I was on interstates, and I would come up to these signs saying, please pave the toll road with credit card, because that cash is filthy, it's dirty, it carries germs, and you can get COVID if you pull cash out of your wallet. They weren't quite like that, but they were strongly advocating against cash. I'd never forgotten that. So cash, just remember, cash is, from their point of view, cash is bad. From your point of view, you should realize cash is good. But in season 4, I'm going to really kind of drill down into the legal roots of, what is money legally and what's the basis for it. Another thing I want to answer is, what exactly did the Fed do that was new in 1913? What was the banking system before? How are things structured before? What magic trick did the Fed do that it didn't have? Because bankers were in control before 1913. They had an enormous power before 1913. They caused the Panic of 1907, among others. They were able to cause panic after panic after panic. It wasn't like they didn't have power, but they didn't have central power. So what was it that the Fed did? Did the Federal Reserve Act enable the bankers to do after 1913 that they couldn't do before? And that's an interesting question too, because these plans, as you know, are implemented over decades and over hundreds of years. And to get a sense for where they're going, you have to know where they've come from. And there's no real good source to figure out legally kind of what has gone on with money from the beginning. I'll tell you a great book on that, though, is Bank Robbery, I think it was written in 2020, came out in 2020 by an author named Ivo Mosley, Mosley. It's 150 pages. It's a short read. It's a short legal history of money. It's outstanding. And that kind of gave me the idea, I should really kind of lay this out, because once you see where it's been, the trajectory in the past, you can kind of extrapolate into the future. And that's really what I'm after in season 4.
Excellent. Well, I, for one, am salivating thinking about this season 4, because I know you do the deep dives, and I am extremely interested in this subject. And I think we could all do with more actual meat on the bones of the question of monetary history. I think it is absolutely central to what we find going on politically around the world. I think monetary system really wags the political tail, or is the tail that wags the political dog, whatever metaphor you want to come up with for that. So
it's hugely important, and it's not discussed, and it's not taught. We're all taught. The hardest thing about understanding the money system in the U.S. and really throughout the West, the hardest part of it isn't learning new stuff. It's unlearning the garbage that's in my head right now.
Yep.
The piggy bank model. The bank's going to make a loan. They're going to go to the vault. There is no vault. They just go click, 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 and create thin air. It takes a long time to unlearn that stuff.
Mummy, where does money come from? Is another one of your videos that I have cited many times, because this is important stuff and people need to know it. And you lay it out in a way that's very presentable, so I'm looking forward to that. So people who are interested in your work, is Substack the best place to go for your work, or what would you recommend? Substack came up because, on YouTube shadow bans the heck out of my videos. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to put it on Substack. So the people who really want to know what I'm going to do, go to Substack. I'll tell you, videos coming out here, interview. So for example, you and I are doing this interview. Undoubtedly, it will not appear on YouTube.
I want people to know about it. I will go on Substack. I will tell people, my Substack subscribers, got a new interview with Corbett. Here's where to find it. Here's what we talked about. Look at these other videos.
Yep. Excellent.
So to answer your question, Substack is that's the where to go.
All right. I will definitely have that link as well as the link to all your various channels so people can follow it, and I hope they will do so. I hope that answers PK Adams' question enough. Is there anything else you'd like to say to PK Adams before we go?
Not on that specific question. I think some changes are coming now. The economy is noticeably softening, and undoubtedly, I'm getting more and more nervous about the bird flu and the noises I'm hearing coming out of there. A lot of echoes I'm hearing from 2020 I find deeply disturbing, but that's a story for another day.
Well, sadly, I don't think we've seen the end of the past 2 years of craziness. I don't think it's all tied up now, but we will stay tuned for more on that. All right, John Titus, thank you again for your time.
Thanks, James Corbett. I'll see you.